So today we're going to continue our journey through Matthew. And if you've been reading the book of Matthew with us, good job. Keep it going. Keep trying to read when you're able to. And when you aren't able to, you just pick up again on whatever day we are on. So we're traveling through the whole book of Matthew. And I want you to understand something about this. These books are so beautifully written. And in the book of Matthew, there is a climax, which will be the death and then resurrection of Jesus Christ. But I want you to understand that while the resurrection of Jesus was a total surprise, the death of Jesus was not. You see, because all through Jesus' ministry, he was making people angry. He was making them uncomfortable. He was upsetting the status quo. In your reading, notice all the times that people are frustrated with Jesus, are questioning his theology, are wondering why he says what he says. So eventually, his death is not a surprise. We could have seen it coming. There's all kinds of signs that he's making the wrong people angry. So that's where we're going to start our reading today. And this is a story that I'm going to read to you out of Matthew 12, verses 1 through 8. At that time, Jesus went through the wheat fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they were picking heads of wheat and eating them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are breaking the Sabbath law." But he said to them, "Haven't you read what David did when he and those with him were hungry? He went into God's house and he broke the law by eating the bread of the presence, which only the priests were allowed to eat. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple treat the Sabbath as any other day and are still innocent? But I tell you something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means, I want mercy, not sacrifice, you wouldn't have condemned the innocent. The human one is the Lord of the Sabbath." All right, so here we go again. Jesus is making people mad. And so I want to tell you a little about who the people are, because a lot of times we hear words, but we don't really understand them, and that's pretty normal. So during the day of Jesus, there were two religious parties. They kind of ruled and reigned, and everybody was aware of them. They were very, very well known, and they had a big impact on the society around them. The first were the Sadducees. This was the wealthy religious leaders. They were over or had control over the priests. But the common people didn't really relate to them because they were wealthy and they were probably a little more progressive. And most people were like, they knew they were there, they tolerated them, but they didn't love the Sadducees. But then there was another group called the Pharisees. Now, by the time Jesus was starting his ministry in the first century, there's estimated there were about 6,000 Pharisees. And these men were in charge of keeping the law of Moses intact. They were interpreters of the law, and their job was to guide the people in how to interpret the law and live out the law correctly. And the common people loved them. They were highly respected, and common people were more likely to listen to a Pharisee than the king or the priest. So the Pharisees were who everybody was listening to. They were the influencers of that day. And there were some Pharisees that liked Jesus. We learn of Nicodemus, who was open to the teaching of Jesus. And later on, Joseph of Arimathea, he was open to Jesus. And then the most famous person, the Apostle Paul, he started out as a Pharisee, but he didn't become in relation to Jesus until after Jesus had died, had been resurrected, and ascended into heaven. Then he became a Jesus follower. But most of the other Pharisees were kind of irritated with Jesus, kind of frustrated with him. He was messing up the status quo, and people were following Jesus because he was healing them, and they were getting impressed by Jesus, and this was very threatening to the Pharisees. And so the story we just read about, this passage, it's about Sabbath. And Sabbath was a really serious thing that the people took very serious about how to keep the Sabbath. I want to read a scripture to you that comes from the Old Testament when Moses gave the Sabbath as a gift to the people. And this is what he said: "Remember the Sabbath day and treat it as holy. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work on it. not you, your sons or your daughters, your male or female servants, your animals, or the immigrants who is living with you, because the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything that is in them in 6 days, but rested on the seventh day. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So here's the deal. Old Testament teaches through the Mosaic law that the Sabbath means something. And someday I'm going to do a sermon series on the Sabbath because I think we ignore the Sabbath. We think the Sabbath is optional. We struggle in our culture. We are a busy people. But God created the Sabbath for people like us who tend to work too much. How many of you did not bother going to bed early last night, knowing you were going to lose an hour? See, we don't always take good care of ourselves. We work too much. We do too much. We have so many things going that we don't always rest. And so God creates a day, and he said, time to stop, rest. And he knows us so well that he says, and your employees better be allowed to rest, and even your animals need to rest. I mean, he's serious. He loves all creation, and he's serious about resting. And so this law that the Pharisees were enforcing, the law they were teaching about, they understood the importance of it. Sabbath is very, very important. And God is interested us in keeping the Sabbath. But we have to remember the Sabbath has limits. So what Jesus and his disciples were doing that was making everybody mad was on the Sabbath, they're walking through a field and they're hungry, and so they're eating off the tops of the wheat. It doesn't sound very appetizing, so they must have been really hungry. And the Pharisees see this, and where they're in trouble, it's not the eating, it's the breaking it off. Because the Sabbath rules said no work. Absolutely no work. And so they were not respecting what the Pharisees were teaching. And I think it's really important because we no longer live by the law in the same way, and so we kind of diminish the law a little bit. But the law was a gift to the people of Israel, and they took it very seriously. In fact, in Psalms 119, it talks about the exuberant joy of keeping the law. You see, for the Jewish people, the law was this day in and day out reminder that they were special. They were set aside as God's people. It was a reminder of the covenant that God made with them. And it was important because life was harsh. And there were those who oppressed them. And so they needed this reminder. So this practice of keeping the law meant something to them. They didn't put it down and say, oh, what a drudgery. Now, the law became at times too much for them to bear, but they also valued the law. And so the Pharisees really were offended by this just breaking of the law so the disciples could have something to eat. The problem here is that when we get really good at laws, sometimes we forget the purpose of the law. Have you ever done that? You get so caught up in doing it right that you forget why you're doing it. I had a friend who used to talk about his mom would have a party every year, and I would say, oh, that sounds so cool that she has this party. And he'd say, it's not fun because she's so stressed about having the house perfect. It's not fun. That's kind of like losing the purpose, losing why you're doing something, right? You no longer have fun when you're planning a party. That doesn't make sense because you're so caught up in the way it should be, your idea of how it should be. And that was what was happening with the people. They were so caught up in keeping the law that they were missing the whole purpose of the law, which was that the purpose of the law is that we love each other and that we extend mercy to each other. That was the purpose of the law, and it was a reminder to us. Now, Jesus, when he's talking to the Pharisees and he's addressing this issue, he goes back to an Old Testament story, and he says, don't you remember that story about David? He's referring to a story found in 1 Samuel 21. And what happens is David and his men, this is David of the Old Testament, eventually comes King David, they are on a mission by the king, and they're out on this mission, and they're starving, and there's no food around. And so David comes into a synagogue, and there's a priest there. And he's got bread, but the bread is for the offering. It's not to eat. And David asks for the bread, and the priest decides to give it to him, and it says, so the priest gave David holy bread, because there was no other bread except the bread of the presence, which was removed from the Lord's presence and replaced by warm bread as soon as it was taken away. You see, there's no judgment in here. The priest understood that that bread had a greater need than keeping the law. These men were on a mission from the king, and they were hungry, and they needed to eat so they would not grow weary. And so the priest made the right decision. He realized the law, as beautiful as it is, it has to be balanced out. We got to remember the purpose of the law, to love people and to extend mercy. In fact, the priest understood that God's demand for mercy is more important than any temple or any laws of Moses. That people are the most important. People always come first. Well, the Pharisees are not satisfied with what Jesus says, and so they follow him. Jesus leaves this little group of people, and if you were to read a couple more verses, it says he goes to the synagogue to pray, and the Pharisees follow him there. They're not done. And they follow him to the synagogue, and when they get there, there's people gathered in the synagogue. So this is done very publicly, and there's a man there who is praying as well in the synagogue, and he has a withered hand. He's handicapped. And the Pharisees come in and they see him and they think, oh, well, now we got Jesus. We got a good question because he's going to say the wrong thing. We're going to have him there. And so they ask Jesus this question, are you allowed to heal on the Sabbath? I mean, it's really kind of cruel. This man is standing there. Everybody's aware of what's going on. They're using his handicap very cruelly as an example to trip up Jesus. There's no concern for the man. There's no concern for his feelings. They just simply say, all right, Jesus, now we have you. Are you allowed to heal on the Sabbath? Well, Jesus' reply to them is very practical. In Matthew 12, he says, who among you has a sheep that falls into a pit on the Sabbath and will not take hold of it and pull it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? So the law allows a person to do what is good on the Sabbath. Jesus brings it down to nuts and bolts. He says, so let's say on the Sabbath your sheep falls into a hole. If you leave it there, it might be dead by the next day, right? You don't leave an injured sheep in the hole. You get on your knees and you pull that sheep out because those sheep cost something, right? You realize there's a law that says I'm not supposed to work, but I have to deal with my sheep. It'll impact my income. Of course I have to do that. And Jesus gives this beautiful example like, come on now. You know the answer to this. This man is more valuable than a sheep. This man means something. His life matters. So he questions their understanding of mercy, and then he heals the man. You know, sometimes we get kind of in the same mode. Rules are wonderful. Hear me. I don't want to live in a world without rules. I don't want to get on the street and drive without stop signs and street lights, right? I want police officers to stop idiots who are speeding in my neighborhood. I want rules. I want consequences. I want to live in a world where I feel safe. I love rules. I really do. I'm a rule keeper. But the problem with rule keepers is that sometimes we forget that people matter more than the rules. Sometimes we get so caught up in keeping the rules that we forget that the people around us need mercy. Think about the last time your kid broke a rule. You want to kill them. They knew the rule. You said the rule. You explained the rule, and they still break the rule. And I'm not saying we don't have rules for our kids. The reality is, though, it requires mercy sometimes when you're a parent. You better be praying all the time because it is tricky raising kids. And sometimes they need consequences, and sometimes they need mercy. That's the key to parenting. It's not easy. Let me tell you a story. Back in 1988, it was the middle of the winter, and there was a group of nuns walking through the south area of the Bronx looking for abandoned buildings. These women were called the Missionaries of Mercy. They were a part of a sect that worked for Mother Teresa. She was the head of it. And they were on a mission because Mother Teresa, a couple years before, had visited Mayor Ed Koch when he was in the hospital. And he and she had cooked up a deal. So these women went searching, looking for a building because they wanted to open a homeless shelter. So on 148th Street, they found 2 burnt-out buildings, and they thought, we can work with this. And the city of New York sold them those 2 buildings for $1 a piece. That was the deal that she had made with Mayor Cox. And it's kind of amazing. So they had these, and so these women, they had $500,000, and they were going to renovate these buildings to make this homeless shelter. They believed they could home 64 people in each shelter. They made plans and design. There was going to have a common room on the main floor, and then they were on the second, and there was going to be a kitchen and a dining room, and on the second floor there was going to be another common room, and then bedrooms, and on the third floor there were going to be bedrooms too. It was a 3-story building. And they were excited about it. They had the plans, they were ready to go. It took about 1.5 years of bureaucracy to get the plans approved, right? These ladies went from hearing to hearing to hearing to finally get approved to get started. And then finally they started renovating these buildings. This was going to be a blessing to so many of the homeless community in New York, and a blessing to New York itself, because it would get them off the streets, out of the cold, and someplace safe. About 1.5 years into the project from there, they hit a wall. They were told that they had to put in elevators. Here's the deal. These groups of women had all taken a vow of poverty, but they also took a vow of abstaining from using modern appliances and modern conveniences. In these homeless shelters, there would be no washing machines because they were going to all require everybody to wash their clothes by hand. There was going to be no dishwashers because people were going to wash dishes. That was their vow, and those living there were going to learn and work together to create a community. And they said, we can't have an elevator because we can't use it. We won't get in it. We'll have to carry the people who need help up the stairs. That's our plan. And the city said, no, you have to have an elevator. And they said, but we're not going to use it. And they said, it doesn't matter. There's rules. There's laws. You have to have an elevator. And they fought for a while. And then eventually, the Missionaries of Charity wrote a very kind letter to the city of New York and said, we are pulling out. We've decided we can use the money that's left to buy sandwiches and soup for people who are hungry. We decided your laws are far too complex for us. Philip K. Howard observes this story and says this: no person decided to spite Mother Teresa. It was just the law. Yet he argues that the story of the Missionaries of Charity in New York reflects how rules can replace thinking. The result, what Howard calls the death of common sense. I think Jesus would agree with that. I think that's what he was trying to say to the Pharisees, the death of common sense. You have to have common sense. What is more important, rules or people? Hands down, it's people. You know what happened as a result of that interaction between the Pharisees and Jesus? Well, after their encounter with him, they were convinced Jesus had to go. Matthew 12:14 says, the Pharisees went out and met in order to find a way to destroy Jesus. We know how the story ends. But we also understand rules matter. What Jesus said matters. In all of our lives, it's too easy to get caught up in the rules. It's too easy to decide who is good and who is bad. It's too easy to decide who's in and who's out. It's too darn easy if you just live by rules. We are called to live in a tension constantly. We don't get to live in a comfort of decisions. We need to live in this tension, forever questioning, is it rules or is it mercy? We are called to be a people of mercy. And at times it will be confusing. At times it will not feel comfortable. At times it'll say, this is different than I was raised. But we are called to mercy. And there's no questioning that. Jesus is clear. It cost him his life. And it may cost you something. But it's what he calls us to. It's what we cannot ignore. And so I ask you today to ask yourself, I'm asking myself, where am I caught up in the rules? And where have I forgotten mercy? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.